trust, in the digital world that we have in the physical world. But to have a trusted ID, it has to provide, to be strong and trusted, it has to provide a link, a certifiable link between the individual and the digital ID, while it's protecting privacy and security of the individual. And thanks to this trusted digital ID, the potential to provide public and private sector entities with new and efficient ways to reach and serve populations, generate enormous savings while improving efficiency, accountability and transparency. To discuss the role of strong identity in e-governance, we will have very happy to welcome Hannes Astok from the e-Governance Academy. As you know, Estonia has built a society where public and private digital services are woven into the fabric of everyday life. Digital trusted identity is also proving transformative for the 1.1 billion people in the developing countries which currently lack any form of officially recognized identity. To address this topic, we will have a presentation from Sanjay Vatkar from WCC Smart and Search. As I was saying, the issue of trust is fundamental in the digital ecosystem. And as custodians of the root identity, governments need to build their digital identity ecosystem based on robust legal and technical frameworks, interoperable, not only across sectors, but also across borders. To address this topic, Adam Cooper from ID Crowd will discuss the principle, but also the importance of authoritative sources of trust, interoperability, and the direction of travel for digital identity. But as we know, thanks to regulation and innovative identification solutions, it is now possible to create robust and secure citizen ID without infringing on civil liberties. And to discuss this topic, I'll be very happy to welcome Estelle Massé from Civil Society Access Now, who will be presenting the role of civil society in building new e-governance model and the balance between regulation, ethics and innovation, especially as we embark on new avenues such as artificial intelligence. In Europe, the recent initiative like eIDAS regulation, GDPR have set down guidelines for secure electronic identification and trust services, the e-privacy regulation in relation to handling of personal data. But if you look at the UN e-government survey 2018, you will see that we still have a long way to go when it comes to the enablement of e-government that supports transformation towards sustainable and resilient society. So we have a certain number of high-profile e-government implementation, we can see there's still a long way to go. Today, actually, we will be very happy to welcome Mr. Aliyu Abubakar Aziz from the National Identity Management Commission of Nigeria, who will present Nigerians' plan for identity system. We will also have an illustration of cross-border services thanks to Trusted ID with David Rennie. Unfortunately, I have to apologize for South Africa and Uruguay, who had internal issues and warned us only late last week that they wouldn't be able to make the trip. But one thing that comes out of it is that collaboration and sharing best practices are really of key importance if we want to continue building this resilient society. And that was one of the reasons the Secure Identity Alliance was created a few years ago. We are dedicated to supporting the provision of legal trusted identity for all and to drive the development of inclusive digital services necessary for sustainable worldwide economic growth and prosperity. And the way we do that is by bringing together public, private and non-government organizations to foster international collaboration on the issues of legal identity, help shaping policy and provide technical and implementation guidance for national and international ID system. We've been active in supporting the evolution of trusted digital identity frameworks, working with government and other organizations. For example, as part of a global partnership network initiated by the World Bank, we've helped define the 10 key principles for identification system in the digital age. We also publish reports and develop tools everything can be downloaded or used on our website. And most recently, we've developed a landmark SOS application program that addresses the ID ecosystem harmonization challenge, enabling interoperability among registries and opening the door to initiating modern eID system in the world. And I will have my colleague Deborah Comperin to present the initiative later on. But this is also why we're here today, you know, this collaboration and sharing best practices. And while I could speak hours on identity and bore you, I'm much happier and very honored to welcome today a real set of experts from government, industry and civil society to present and discuss every aspect of how to design digital ID system and how ID technology is moving the identity management practice and debate. So to open the track, I'm very happy to welcome Hannes Astok. Hannes is the Deputy Director of the Estonian e-Governance Academy, a non-governmental organization providing training and consultancy for government in many regions of the world. But prior to that, Hannes is a former member of Estonian Parliament and Deputy Mayor of Estonia's second largest city, Tartu. And as an MP, he has dealt mainly with the development of the information society and issues related to the regulation of intellectual property and electronic communication. Please join me in welcoming Hannes Astok. Thank you.
Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you had good lunch, and I need to wake you up again. My name is Hannes Astok. I'm coming from Estonia. How many of you have been in Estonia? Okay, both of you, yeah? So it's a really small country. It's 1.2 million people, so or 1.3, okay, doesn't matter that much. In some cases, you may say that it's so small country, it's easy to make changes. At the same time, as it's very small, also resources what are available for the changes are much more smaller than in bigger countries. So please consider it. But let us move to the topic, and I will explain you briefly what are the key elements of e-governance and how strong digital identity is very much connected to this topic, and what is the Estonian understanding about this issue and how we solve those issues in case of Estonia, and also what are the lessons learned in Estonia. So first of all, if we are speaking about e-government and e-government development, World Bank made last year in 2017 a report, Digital Dividends, and it's emphasizing that if you are building up e-government, there are definitely very important so-called digital elements. It's digital databases, interoperability, it's a digital identity, services, cybersecurity, sectoral solutions. It's all very important because
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Sanjay Dharwadkar, and today afternoon I will talk about ID for sustainable development. I'm sorry that I could not be with you in person due to another engagement, but I will certainly take you through some of the important points of my presentation. Everyone on the planet needs an ID, but not everybody has one. As this slide shows you, that barely 5% of the planet's population have an ID. And such people, such individuals usually have multiple IDs.
This is one of the very first pictures of Estonians. It's made like 140 years ago, and it's a typical Estonian family having dinner. They are very talkative, as you can see, Estonians are. We are a very Nordic nation. Is there someone from Finland in the hall? Okay. Finns are much more north from us, and they are even less talkative than Estonians. And this is the reason why Finns were those guys who were inventing short messages. This is true story. But Estonians are not worse. We invented Skype. And both are serving the same purpose, not to talk to each other, not to look at the eyes to the other person. It's much more easier for us, for Finns and Estonians, to send messages, not to tell you, I love you, but send a message, I like you, maybe, tomorrow. So, for this reason, Estonians, you know, having this kind of typical conversation. So, now like 140 years has gone, and what has happened? Not that much has happened. The same family having a dinner and communicating through Skype or Facebook or whatever messenger. But what is the lesson actually? Whatever the nation is, talkative, non-talkative, it's typical family today globally having dinner. All family members are engaged in their smartphones and tablets. No one is talking to each other. Okay, let us leave the family affairs aside, but another lesson is that also citizens want to communicate with the government through the digital means. We are not happy anymore to go to government offices because government offices are out of date. Everyone is buying flight tickets from the websites. Everyone is booking their hotels from hotels.com or booking.com. Everyone is applying for or buying goods from Amazon or any other web store. But still we need mostly go to the government offices to apply for whatever. To confirm that I am Hannes Astok, to confirm that I'm living in certain address, to confirm that my dog name is John, I own this car, and so on and so on. It's still the same procedures like it was almost 100 years ago. So let's take a look what is the bottleneck actually. So as said, the typical picture is that if you are a citizen or businessman need to get whatever certificate from the government, you need to go to a government office once, and second time to get another certificate, what is proving your, first one what is proving that you are yourself, the second one what is proving that you are living in certain address, the third one what is proving that you own this business, and when you have get all those certificates from the government institutions, you are putting them into one file, and then you're submitting it back to another government office. So governments are not reusing the data. And all those certificates, what you are getting from the government, from those government databases, are actually outprints of the government databases. It's just small piece of data what is printed there in the government official letterhead and saying that yes, your name is Hannes Astok. Many governments are approaching so-called one-stop shop approach. What is much better? You just need to visit government office once to submit your documents or your application, and the government official is collecting the data for you and organizing that you are getting the response. But you need to visit probably the office second time to get your documents or the certificate what you were asking, or the service, whatever it is. So in many countries, especially in developing countries, it means that you may need to develop you need to travel once to the government office, what may take a day, and then you need to travel the second time to pick up your document, what may take another day. So the time consumption, not in the government side, but in the citizen or business side, is still pretty high. We discussed it in Estonia, and we decided that let's better move to online services immediately. Let's have the self-service available. So basically, you can automate a lot of processes in the government service delivery, in the government administrative service processes, and you can provide most of the services actually online. So what do you need for it? You need that this digital data, what is in government, the data, what is in government databases must be in digital format and accessible. Secondly, you need to have a portal, what is like putting the services together, and you need to have a secure data exchange. And finally, you need to have a strong digital identity for citizens. And let's have a quick look how it's functioning in Estonia. But first of all, online services versus offline services. we have like measured a little bit how long it takes to get the services in offline format or in online format. And as you can see from this picture, you can save a lot of time, what is translated to money, if you are getting your services online versus offline. Establishing a company online takes 15 to 30 minutes in Estonia. If you need to run all those offices to submit all your paperwork, it may take full day from you. To submit a VAT declaration online, it takes 7 minutes. If you need to travel somewhere to submit it on paper format, it takes more than an hour, and so on and so on. So the savings are huge, and especially in time, and not in government side, but especially in business and citizen side. Well, the digital data accessible. It's, the first question is that if your data is not in digital format, but in paper format, no machine cannot access it. Okay, this is very well organized archive, probably from Germany. But if your population register in this format, or even worse, your national tracks are kept in this format, it's the big risk is not only that you cannot read it, machines cannot read it, but the biggest problem is that they may be destroyed when the next flooding or typhoon or whatever is appearing. And those were real pictures of what I made in one country, unfortunately. So we need to make this data digital. And if we are making this data digital, we also need a single numeric identifiers for the citizens, businesses, land parcels, property, and many other important objects. Because if you're trying to identify the citizens by name, so you can imagine how many John Smiths are living in Nigeria or in US, so it's really hard to identify them just by name. Secondly, once only principles should be considered. Citizens or businesses never have to provide the same data for the government again and again. How to make it possible, this is also partly technical question, and I come back to it, but anyway, this should be considered when you're starting to create your databases, and no duplicated data should be in the government databases. And this is the principle what we have implemented also in Estonia. Secondly, there should be a secure data exchange or governmental interoperability, if you like to call it in a way. This is the picture from Estonia to illustrate what are the connections between various government institutions in data exchange. All those green dots are showing various government institutions, ministries, agencies, municipalities, and all those black lines are data exchange connections between them. And as you can see from this picture, there is a huge data exchange almost on daily basis between the government institutions. If you like to build it up one by one, all those data connections between various institutions, you are ending up in big mess. To make it possible legally, technically, privacy-wise, security-wise, you need something what is better organized than this picture. Is there someone from Italy? Okay, sorry, we are calling it spaghetti connection picture, but it's just because we admire your kitchen. So we need to organize it somehow better. And in Estonia, we implemented Estonian governmental secure data exchange solution, what is called X-Road or Crossroad, if you like. And this has been in business already for more than 15 years and currently connecting all Estonian government databases, providing more than 1,500 services and providing services for more than 900 organizations, both public and private one. And also the number of transactions per year is very high. It's more than 500 million transactions per year. You may ask why this number is so big. Is it like surveillance state that government is asking all the time the data about citizens from other government institutions? Probably not. But there is a set of transactions where big number of citizens are involved. Let me give you an example. Every month, the Social Security Authority is paying out pension, social subsidies, whatever other subsidies, for more than 500,000 Estonians. They are retired persons, young mothers, parents, whatever other ones. So this means that every time, like every month, on the third day of every month, when we are starting out those pensions and subsidies, we are making one query towards the population registry who is keeping our citizens database. And what is the question what they are asking before paying out all those social subsidies and pensions from the, what is the question what they are asking from the National Population Database? You can guess. Any ideas? They are asking, are those persons are still alive before paying out all those pensions and subsidies? Or another question, are they still living in Estonia? And getting answer that yes, unfortunately, there is no emotions definitely, that, those 1,000 persons has, or whatever is the number, are passed away, not eligible anymore. They don't pay anymore for them pensions and any subsidies. But if you multiply Estonian population to some other country's population, let's take Nigeria, 150 million, you can imagine what could be the savings just from not paying out pensions and other subsidies to the persons who are passed away. So, so this means that all those, this kind of massive queries can also save a huge money for the government. This is a picture of X-Road. I don't stop on it, and I'm not very much technical guy also, but you can later ask the questions about it or dig in if you're Googling X-Road. But this system, what is decentralized system, allows the secure data exchange between the government institutions, allows certified and time-stamped questions and answers towards the databases and from the databases, and allows also the once only principle implementation. The data is stored only, one type of data set is stored only in one database, and all other government institutions can make queries, if it's definitely based on legislation, towards those databases and get the right answers. It's decentralized, there is no single point of failure. It's also well-protected personal data, and there is a legal value for the request and answer. And also there is a government portal. I don't stop on it, but to log into the government portal, you also need a strong digital identity. You still can log on with bank credentials, but it will end by the end of this year. Well, but now to the topic, strong digital identity. In 1993, Peter Steiner drew this cartoon, what was published in New Yorker magazine. And as you can see, one dog is asking from another that, don't worry, I'm telling to another, don't worry, on internet, nobody knows you are a dog. And I think it's much more relevant today than it was 25 years ago. And many governments still are telling us that why we need government trusted identity. We have Google identity, everyone is having Facebook account. Can we use it for the government operations also? Okay, if you like to pay subsidies for the dogs, you can. But for more sophisticated transactions, most probably you need something what is really connects the physical identity and the digital identity. We started the process of digital identity issuance in 2002 with Estonian ID card. This is already the second version, what is running, and currently the whole population plus the set of Estonian residents are covered with active ID cards. Also there is a mobile ID, what is SIM card based identity, and I come back to it. And also there is smart ID, what is software based identity available. And as you can see from the statistics, and you can look at the statistics every day if you like, from this link, yesterday the strong government trusted identity was used more than 1 million times in Estonia. This means that this is not only for the government. This ecosystem is open for almost everyone, for every company, for every citizen who likes to use it. And the biggest number of those transactions are not coming from the communication with the government. You think that every adult Estonian is making every day one transaction with the government. It is mainly from the banking. In most of the cases, if you're logging on into your bank account online and doing transactions, you are using one of those credentials. And when you are verifying your bank transaction, you are using the same credentials. So the ID card is very popular. This is first national document, and it's also very important. It's coming with a chip. There is no excuses. In some countries, they made a chip optional, so you can apply for the card either with chip, either without chip. In Estonia, this is compulsory. And in those countries who made the chip voluntary, we have seen that unfortunately citizens are taking usually the card without chip because it's usually also cheaper. In case of Estonia, you are getting card with a chip, but you don't need to use it if you don't like. It's your voluntary choice. But you have an option to start to use it in any moment. So this means that all Estonian citizens are getting the cards. The passport is optional if you need to travel to third countries outside of European Union. And the card is really in digital format is the key to all services. You can log into all government services, but you can log into most of also non-government services who are asking for strong digital identity. There is also 5 minutes left. There is also, as a next step, we implemented mobile ID, what is SIM card-based identity, and the verification process goes in the way that you need to go to your mobile operator, ask for the mobile ID, and you need to activate with your ID card. And the same services are available, and more than or close to 200,000 users. And the mobile ID users were, until the smart ID was appearing, the most active digital identity users in Estonia, because mobile ID was much more convenient than smart card. And finally, we have smart ID, what is software-based option. To activate it, you need to have, again, ID card or mobile ID, and based on it, you can activate it immediately by yourself. And it's really growing rapidly now. There is, in 3 Baltic countries, there is already 1.3 million users, and in Estonia, there was already 300,000 users. And it's really growing rapidly. And they recently get also qualified signature creation device certification from TÜVIT, so it's now recognized also Europe-wide. What is the efficiency? The digital signature is saving 20 minutes per transaction. What is the outcome of a World Bank development report? So you can use those digital identification tools trusted by the government almost everywhere. This is Swedbank, what is the dominant Estonian retail bank. You can use smart ID, ID card, mobile ID, still until by the end of the year, password code or PIN calculator. But this is really, PIN calculator is still the minority, very small minority who is using it. And this is win-win situation both for the bank and users, because users don't need to purchase the PIN calculator and banks do not need to develop their own identification systems. The same, another retail bank, SEB, using ID card, mobile ID, or smart ID. The online pharmacy, the same. You can log in with your strong identity, and you can immediately getting also access to the national pharmaceuticals repository or medical prescriptions repository, so you can also buy online the prescribed medicals. It's also telecoms, various ones to log into their systems. It's also retail stores and so on. So we calculated what is the benefit. From this 20 minutes, cumulatively, you are saving every year almost 5 working days. That is a pretty big number, isn't it? 5 working days is 1 working week. So we can save basically 2% of working time. So this means that we can be like 2% productive, 2% more productive annually, and grow like our GDP by 2%. And in big narrative, as we are spending 2% in Estonia for defense, so we can say that thank you for digital identity, we can afford defense. So, and as you know about our neighbors, it's almost necessary. And this is not about Finland. Well, also about take-up. As you can see, we started in 2002 with rollout of Estonian national ID cards. So this means that it takes a time little bit until people started to use the online services also. So this means that you need to roll out the cards, but you need also to provide the services. And it's like question about egg and hen. So if you are providing infrastructure, only after it the services will appear. Maybe if you start in whatever country tomorrow, there is already services available, so you need to transfer them to the strong digital identity ecosystem. So this means that there is a lot of room for improvement. And currently, Estonians have provided more than 500 million digital signatures. And if you just calculate that one digital signature may save 2 euros, and it's probably true, not just printing papers out, not signing them, not mailing them, not putting to the envelope, not putting stamp, it is probably even greater. Our post office is not happy about it, definitely, but they are very busy to deliver Alibaba parcels, so they are busy anyway already. And on the top of it, you must have in place those analog elements. There should be a good legislation and regulations. There should be good government organizations supporting it. And most important, there should be a political will to drive those changes. What is the future? We think that in Estonia that the future is very much in mobile devices, because in our so-called old world in Europe, we still use computers. But most of the population globally will never use traditional computers or laptops. But they will use smartphones or tablets, whatever the size of a screen varies. And then they want to have everything in their mobile device. And our dream is that also the government is just one mobile application for the citizens. The interface with the government is just mobile application. You don't need to know where is this office or another office. You don't need to know who is registering your land parcel, who is registering your car. So you don't need where all those offices are located or who is providing this service. And the services must be proactive and also intuitive and available 24/7. So basically, if my driving license is expiring, the only thing what I want to know from the government is a reminder that, Hannes, your driving license is expiring. Do you want to get a new one? Because they know that my driving license is expiring. How many of you know when your driving license is expiring? How many of you have taken a look to your driving license during last year? Okay, there is one person only. You never take a look to your driving license. You never know when it's expiring. So basically government knows it from their information systems. We also know that you have a right to drive, so you are not speeding very often. We also can ask you to send your health certificate if needed, or generate the inquiry for it immediately. And if you need to get the payment from you, we can send it to your internet bank. So basically, the only thing what I should do is just push yes, and the government will send me the driving license to my home address, because they know my home address from the registries already. So this is probably the future, what we like to see. But the government is proactive, intuitive, and not disturbing us very much in the service delivery process. What are the lessons learned in Estonia? Government trusted in identity is critical. If it's existing in digital format, if a government is putting together the digital identity and physical identity of the citizens, all other stakeholders, banks, telecommunications, all other businesses can use it and can benefit from it. It's a huge saving for a whole nation if there is a government trusted identity and everyone can use it. And there is no need that every company is starting to develop their own digital identity schemes. Secondly, the ID infrastructure must be easy to access for the citizens. If there is too many options, if there is too many opportunities, too many application forms you need to select, most probably you are opting not to select anyone. So if it's clear, simple, and government trusted, people are starting to use it, and it takes time from their side to start to use it. So for this reason, it must be easy to apply and join the scheme. And finally, there should be a honest public communication to keep the trust. If there is a problem, and we had recently the problem with ID card chips because of a vendor, there should be a honest public communication between the government and citizens to keep this trust up. We have built up this trust during the last 15 years, but it is possible to demolish this trust in 15 minutes. So there should be honest public communication available, and in case of Estonia, either the so-called crisis in ID cards were there were elections after 1 month, and where the online voting rate remains the same as it was in previous elections. So the trust was there. So thank you very much. Happy to answer the questions.
Thank you very much, Hannes. We'll take 1 or 2 questions. Hannes is staying with us, so we take 1 or 2 questions, and then we'll move to the next speaker, and we can finish by a panel session for. So.
Thank you very much for your presentation and for your sense of humor. Very appreciated. I have a quick question. Yesterday we talked about having one digital identity versus having several digital identity, depending on to which service you will be addressed, or what is your point of view on this?
My point of view is that it should be simple for the citizen. And in case of Estonia, the same digital identity appears for all transactions. You can select, meaning that if it's what format it has. Is it like ID card based? Is it SIM card based, or is it now the software based in smartphone? But it's the same. So you don't need to think what kind of identity I need to use for this or another service. So it's just a simplification issue from the perspective of the citizens. So if it's stronger for the simple service, doesn't matter. Thank you.
I have a question. Thank you for your speech. Did you have a lot of attacks against your system, or how did you solve, for example, problem with ROCA vulnerabilities and this kind of problems?
Yeah, it's definitely permanent topic to fight with attacks, and those are happening definitely. But we have been successful. I mean, not only the not only the identity system, but also the whole ecosystem. And it has been proven that it's sustainable because it's also decentralized. So there is no single point of failure, so it's even survives the attack if some of the points are off, others are there. But definitely the biggest issue is that if there is like electricity shortcut, the nationwide, there is a question how to survive as a nation without electricity and without the digital schemes. You can restore electricity locally, meaning that with the generators. But if the whole ecosystem is down, it's making us very much dependent on this, and we are working hard with it, definitely.
Thank you, sir, for this very interesting presentation. One question about the business model. I think there was a slide you showed where the user can access Swedbank website through the service. In this kind of a transaction, what will happen behind the scene?
Okay, yeah. If a citizen is accessing whatever private service, what is using the identity, in this it's Estonian ID scheme is also consisting private players. There is a certificates provider is private company, what is procured by the government. So basically, what happens behind the scenes that if I'm logging in with my government trusted identity, the trust provider verifies for the company my identity and telling to the company, let's say it's telecom company, that yes, this is Hannes Astok, his ID number is following, and yes, this is him. But the trust service provider don't know for what purpose I'm accessing, what services I'm getting, and so on.
Excuse me. Here.
Yep. Yep.
Okay. Okay. So a while back, you had an issue with certain digital certificates that were issued that you needed to replace once you discovered that vulnerability. Assuming that a country like Nigeria, you used Nigeria several times, and that's where we're from. Assuming that we adopted your model and scaled it up because our population is probably 100 times what you have there. If we had a similar issue, what advice would you have for us as to quickly and rapidly plug that hole and replace this? Because the problem may scale depending on the size of the rollout of that system.
Yeah, most probably the mistake what we made to avoid this issue was that there was a lack of communication between government and chip and card producers. And there is no magic bullet or something what we can do differently next time, because the whole ecosystem is not dependent only on us. We are using services and products of companies also. And if they are making mistakes, it's like accumulating in our ecosystem. And this is the problem. So yes, we are testing them, yes, we are certifying, verifying, so on. But if there is a mistake, what they are not aware about also, it may accumulate. So as early you can recognize it, early you can replace it, and earlier you can start the replacement procedures and so on. What happens in Estonia, that there was a mistake in the chip that was made by Infineon, but what we did, that we were asking citizens to download a new set of software to their chips, ID card chips, and those who were active users, they did it immediately. And there was many of them who didn't do it, but it appears that they were using ID card only very rarely. So actually digital services users were not that much affected.
Hello, thank you very much for the presentation. I work for the Irish Public Service, and I'm really interested in your hearing more about the development of public trust. In particular, just when you started this process, did you consult widely, or was it an ongoing process throughout the development? Is there any kind of pushback amongst the public? Any concerns, particularly in relation to the attacks that you mentioned on the system, and how you've managed to maintain public trust?
Yeah, thank you. Very good question. When we started in, let's say, 2000, basically, when the decision was made to move to the ID card with a chip, if you think back yourself or your country in 2000, like, there was not that much discussion about digital identity at all in those years. And also in Estonian society, there was a discussion about digital identity, but there was no applications almost at all about online services, except like online banking was just started to grow. There was not that much discussion because it was not an issue. But definitely today, if we need to start from point zero today, it will be very much different. But what we have done is endless discussion what it is, how you must behave as a citizen, because the biggest vulnerability is between the desk and chair, meaning the person and its behavior. It's not that much that the technical systems are failing, it's the citizens who are putting still the yellow sticker with the PIN numbers to the ID card, like they do with their credit cards. They are sharing their PIN numbers with whoever, family members or even whatever bad guys. So this is the biggest problem. So how to behave in digital society, what is the cyber hygiene you need to have in basically. And also discuss what it is. So there should be always expert opinion available, really independent one, not just government supported expert opinion, and there should be a clear discussion. And what we have done, there is always like universities, also NGOs are part of this discussion. But maybe we are somehow in lucky situation that there is general trust towards the government is high. So there is no this kind of general feeling what might be in some other countries that government is spying after us, like permanent feeling. But it's true. They do it anyway. So, and if you think what kind of data government owns about you, they own a lot anyway, if you even if you're thinking about it. But so there should be a permanent discussion and honest discussion around it. I think this is the answer, and we can discuss longer what we have done during those years, but this has been generally it should be a discussion, and open, honest discussion. And unfortunately, as someone said, that the biggest problem is not the big brother. The biggest problem is little sister who is chatting about you. And this is how we share by ourselves too much data in social networks and everywhere else about ourselves. So to profile us, we don't need any more government data. We need just data what we have shared by ourselves, too much.
Thank you very much, Hannes. With us, so if more questions come, during the course of the track, please, we'll take many more questions at the end of the track. The next presentation is by Sanjay Dardwakar, who actually sent us his hologram today. So we will play the presentation. Sanjay is going to talk about the sustainable aspect of ID system, like I mentioned earlier. Sanjay is the head of global ID consultancy at WCC in the Netherlands and has 30 years of experience in identity and identification across Asia, Africa and Europe. He's done a lot of work for the EU, ICAO, the World Bank, ISO, and before that he was working in India and worked for UNICEF, so he's really one great expert, and he's actually registered the presentation that he wanted to address and the topic he wanted to discuss with you. If you can play the next presentation.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Sanjay Dharwadkar, and today afternoon I will talk about ID for sustainable development. I'm sorry that I could not be with you in person due to another engagement, but I will certainly take you through some of the important points of my presentation. Everyone on the planet needs an ID, but not everybody has one. As this slide shows you, that barely 5% of the planet's population have an ID. And such people, such individuals usually have multiple IDs. However, look at the bottom of the pyramid. Nearly 1 billion people have almost no identification. This is a very important point and has been included by the United Nations as part of their Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs. The current Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, in fact, in his inaugural address, alluded to the Sustainable Development Goals and said that this will be the core of his work. Among the SDGs, you have SDG 16, and in that 16.9, which states that by 2030, every human being on the planet shall be provided with a legal identity, including free birth registration. Now, let us see some of the figures why this particular problem is of such an overwhelming nature. We have about 7.5 billion people on the planet. Almost about 1 billion have no or minimal ID. About 900 million people live in slums or are homeless. 250 million people have migrated away from their homes looking for a better life. 65 million people are displaced due to conflicts and disasters. 21 million people today are refugees in another country, and 10 million are stateless. In terms of financial implications, around $700 billion can be saved by having proper identities, and nearly $1 trillion can be added by bringing such individuals into the economic mainstream. In order to find a workable strategy towards achieving this objective of having every person on the planet have an identity, a number of UN agencies and development partners have come together and formulated last year what are called the Principles on Identification. Why I take you through the details is that if you are a person or if you are an organization involved in addressing this particular issue, it is very important for you to look at the principles enunciated in this particular document. The important words here are inclusion. Every person must be included and no one shall be excluded. The design shall be such that it has all the positive features which address such issues. And finally, it is the governance. It must be fair, it must be ethical. On the right side, you will see the list of organizations. It literally reads like the who's who of the world who have endorsed and contributed to this particular document. And this includes the SIA, which today is presenting this particular session. I come to a particular point which is often overlooked but is very important, that is the importance of birth registration and therefore the civil registration and vital statistics system for each country. Civil registration, as we know, includes not only birth registration but also death registration, as well as other vital events in an individual's life, such as marriage, separation, adoption, and naturalization. There are various types of laws in the world. Various countries ascribe to civil law, some to common law, and many countries also have aspects of religious law, which becomes a part of their constitution. But all these together are the basis for the legal identity of a person. Some of these aspects are also the basis for entitlement. for healthcare, education, voting, employment, pension, banking, as well as participation in economic activity. The idea is that ID and the economy must be brought together. Look at the picture which you have in front of you. This is the kind of individual who must be able to join the mainstream of the economy using the identity provided and the connection to the economy. What we must remember in today's day and age that this has to be paperless and cashless. It has to connect business, people, and government. It must be an open system with electronic verification, and millions of stakeholders must be able to join using simple APIs. Below is a small block adopted from the India stack, which is already achieving this for millions of people based on the Aadhaar system of identification. The idea is to make it easy for billions of individuals to join the economic mainstream. This is the only complicated diagram that I'm going to show you, but it is not all that complicated. What it shows is that there are different aspects and there are different elements of an ID system, what a country needs. It is never a single ID system. And I draw a simple diagram which shows the CRVS or the civil registration system, the civil identification system, and the functional systems such as banking and payments and voters. The CRVS essentially becomes the custody of the legal identity of the person because it contains all the data elements which are required to define the legal identity of a person. On the other hand, the civil identification system contains elements like biometrics, which enable individuals to be physically identified and their identities to be physically verified. Finally, both these systems are needed to interface with the functional systems so as to determine that benefits are going to the right person and the right individual is asserting his rights. Together, these form the entire ecosystem of the identity of the individuals of a nation. With this, I would like to conclude and say that the importance of this particular topic shall continue till the last person on the planet has been provided with legitimate legal identity. Thank you, and I look forward to be in touch with many of you, and please feel free to write to me if you have any questions, and I'll be happy to respond. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sanjay. Next year we'll talk about holograms and clones IDs. If you have any question to Sanjay, don't hesitate to send him email. But I have to say, we have such a great set of experts on this track today that can also, I'm sure, answer questions that you may have on what Sanjay presented this afternoon. And I would like now to call our next expert, so Adam Cooper. Adam Cooper, who is an identity standard expert, policy lead, and enterprise architect with other 25 years of experience. Sorry, I haven't learned them all by heart, but I know you were with the UK government until very recently, and you are actually one of the chief architects behind the digital ID in the UK. Adam is also chief architect today of ID 2020, and he's done a lot of work for EIDAS, for ISO, the BSI. He's working on the online identity assurance program of Scotland, so you do have a lot of expertise. Please welcome Adam Cooper on interoperability of systems.
Good afternoon, everyone. Is this working? Yeah, that's good. Yes, so thank you, Stephanie. I do have a little bit of experience of building identity systems, but I won't go into that too much. But what I'm going to talk about today is largely about interoperability, but I'm going to start by setting the scene a little bit about some of the things I think are important to remember about identity. And I'm going to start with this one, which crosses over a little bit with some of the themes that Sanjay was talking about. And as Stephanie said, I'm quite happy to answer a lot of the questions about the themes that Sanjay was talking about, because I work in similar fields. I've done a lot of the work with the World Bank that he talked about with the principles. I was involved in that. So if there are questions about that later, then do ask. This actually doesn't come from that. This comes also from the United Nations. But if any of you are familiar with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, then one of the principles there is that everybody has the right to be able to prove their identity. And I think that's very important that we remember that, because when we move into the digital world, quite often we make it difficult for people to do that. And I think that's one of the things we need to avoid. We deliberately, as governments, look at how we can make things really secure and really prove who people are, but that puts barriers in the way. And I want to talk a little bit about the barriers that creates as we go through this. So that's one of the themes I want you to have in your mind as we go forward. The other one here is about thinking about individuals, and we all need to, if you think about that, prove who we are. Because when we're accessing services, we need to be able to make sure that we can get what we want. And that's principally the driver for us as individuals. We don't go online because we want to get a digital identity. I go online because I want to buy a product, or I want to get a benefit from my state because I'm unemployed, or I need health care. I'm not driven by getting a digital identity. Why would I? Why do I need to do that? And so it's not a concept that we're familiar with, yet governments seem very insistent, and I've been partly to blame for this in the past by helping them design these systems, in that you can look at it from a government point of view where you want to make sure that everybody has the same thing. They have this special credential that the government trusts very much. But it's not really about that as an individual, so I want to challenge that premise as well. But the great thing about state-based identity systems is that they do have these authoritative sources of trust. And Sanjay mentioned many of them in the civil registry point of view, so that countries are very good at knowing who are their citizens or residents. They're very good at knowing, they keep registers of births and deaths and all these kind of things. We're not complete in that, particularly for birth registration. That's where the SDGs come in globally. Because we do have this gap in that. But the place to look for these kind of registries is governments. Governments also issue documents that people trust anecdotally. So if I go to buy alcohol in a store and they say, how old are you? How do I do that? We all do it by pulling out a driving license or something like that from our wallet. Why? Because it's what somebody else says about me rather than what I'm saying. And the storekeeper will trust that. He won't check it. He has no idea how to check the special properties of that document, despite all the effort that we've gone into as governments to put them in there with holograms and chips maybe and all these kind of things. They're very useful in some circumstances, but in general, everyday life, they're ignored. But the fact that I've got this thing and it has my photograph on it and it looks a bit like me, well, that's fine. I can buy my alcohol, so that's good. And that's how identity generally works in most cases. And I want you to have that in mind as well, because it's the most cases where I'm using my digital identity that's important. So hopefully I've set the scene a little bit there. I want to talk about what the problems are now as well. And I think there are a few. The biggest one is friction. And what do I mean by friction in identity? Well, I mean, if I'm going to go and do something online, why does it have to be so difficult for me to go through a process of proving who I am? Why do I have to get this special ID card? Or why do I have to go through a process of providing documentation or evidence or proof to get something that a government will issue me that I can then only use for government things usually? So we need to think about that interoperability problem, but we're also making it difficult for me to do something. And there are a lot of talk at the moment about, well, we've got these lovely digital identities that are a high level of assurance, and a lot of the European ones are very much like that for EIDAS. So there's a big push to say, well, let's use that for banking. Let's use it for eKYC, and use it for those kind of purposes. Well, all we end up doing then is just duplicating a lot of that work. So I have to prove it to my government, and I have to prove it to my bank because they do an onboarding process, and it all gets very painful for the user, and people just drop out, and that's a big problem. So it's very off-putting. So a lot of these things are very time-consuming. They're very duplicated, as I've just mentioned, because each service will then look at, well, actually, yeah, you've got this identity thing, but I need to know something specific about you because I've got this onboarding process. So So yes, I know you're a real human being because you've got this really high credential, but I'm going to ask you all these questions anyway. So I end up giving up more information about myself to get to prove eligibility, as we call it in the identity world, which is actually nothing to do with my identity at all. But most of the time, if you think about it, all we really need is a strong credential. You just need to know it's me coming back again and again to do a thing. And this is even true in government. In the UK, when we first started talking to our departments about how their services were going to be digitised and what they might need to do as relying parties as services to consume that identity, what did they all want? They all wanted high levels of assurance. Why? Because they wanted to have as much trust as possible so that they could look to this thing and say, that identity you're providing me, that gives me all the trust I need so I don't have to do anything else myself. I can sort of abdicate myself from the liability issue. What really happens in that situation is, most of the time, and they've come to realise this now after several years, is that what they actually need to know is they need to have a strong credential so they know it's the same individual coming back over and over again, but they actually need to know very little else about me. If you think about most of your interactions with government, if I want to apply for something, for example, so even if I want to start claiming my pension, for example, the state has taken tax from me over my lifetime. It knows about me as an individual. It's got all of that information. All it needs is an activation from me. And what happens is that when I get to a certain age, they'll just send me a letter. And that letter will say, "Oh, Mr. Cooper, you're eligible to take your pension now." So all I actually need to do is just go to a simple service, use a credential that has very low assurance as much as proof of identity, but quite high assurance in the sense of it's a very strong credential, so it can be me this over and over again, and just activate that service, because what's the actual risk? I'll get paid a pension. A fraudster won't be able to do that and get paid a pension because they're not me. So it's all predetermined. So a lot of the time, if I'm claiming unemployment benefit, for example, I can get myself into the system with very low friction. Why is that important? Because if you're a government, what you actually want to do is help people and help the vast majority of people and not put barriers in their way. And this comes back to the friction problem again. So why ask people to go through difficult processes when all you actually want to do is get them into the system and then go through lots of eligibility questions? So I think that's a big problem at the moment. The other one is that privacy isn't always top of the list with governments. They gather lots of information. I spend a lot of time working with governments, and they decide that they're going to build huge civil systems or identity systems, national registers of identity. And they have a whole list of, we want to get this piece of information about people, all sorts of things. Crazy things like, what's your blood type and all this kind of stuff. And why do you need to know that? Blood type's a real one, by the way. So privacy isn't always considered. It's because largely governments think about, well, what do we need to achieve? What's our government priority? It doesn't think about it from the user's perspective always. And privacy is a big part of that. The other problem is interoperability, and I alluded to this before. There are some great government identity systems out there, but they're silos in their own respect. So we've tried very hard in the UK, we've tried very hard in EIDAS for interoperability across member states, but largely it's confined to the public sector, to government. And what we need to do is break out of that and allow those identities to be used elsewhere. If you think about Google and Microsoft and Facebook and all of these, they are all vertical silos of identity. You can use them at best for single sign-on, but you can't use them elsewhere. I can't go to my government and say, oh, here's my Google account. Will you trust that? Not really. But you can't really go to across with identity at all. They're all silos. And this is one of the big things that we need to break out of. And why? Because they've been created as not just credentials, but proofs, as a combination of identity and a credential. And what we need to do is break that model, really, so that we can have credentials that are separate to attributes and to trust. And that will enable us to use them for lots of other things. So digital identity really should be available to everyone. Now, I come from a healthcare background, so I always say things like it should also do no harm. because that's where you come from as a health professional. It's the first thing you should make sure is that you don't harm people. And identity itself is often doesn't have the thought that goes into it of, well, what are the consequences of what we're building here? So a lot of the problems with identity systems are around that. They're not thought through from that point of view. It should also be available to everyone. So it's removing those barriers, making it really easy to get a digital credential. And then think later about, well, how do you, around that, add the different types of proof that are needed for different situations? Rather than starting with a very high bar. A lot of the European systems are like this. In EIDAS, for example, most of the notified schemes are either what we call high or substantial, which are actually quite difficult for people to get. And we need to remember that. We're actually putting an artificial barrier in the way there, which means that we have a digital divide for identity. The other problem with interoperability is that we need to think about, well, how can we make sure that interoperability is not just cross-border, it's really cross-scheme. Cross-border is really just an example of how different schemes should interoperate. It's not a case of, well, I've got a German credentials, therefore it should be able to be used in Belgium. It should be, well, that German credential within Germany should be able to be used everywhere as well. And we don't think about that. We think about, governments think about, well, I will share with another government, but I'm not necessarily going to share with banks or the private sector or the shop on the corner. But why wouldn't they? Why shouldn't it be used in all sectors? And as individuals, we need the ability to have some play in this. We need to be able to make our own decisions rather than having it predetermined by government and government saying, well, yes, you can use your credential for this and for this, but you can't use it over there. But why? Why can't I pick my own credential? If it's a credential that meets international standards, of which there are many, and I work within ISO as well as some of you in the room do, and there are plenty of standards that help us define what a good credential looks like, then why should it be that a government says that, well, actually, you can only use this one thing because that's what we like? Why can't I use this thing that I've already got, like a FIDO key or my mobile phone or whatever it might be that meets equally good standards that are acceptable? I should also be able to decide when I use certain bits of proof about me. And this helps to protect my privacy as well, because I should be able to choose whether I want to use my bank to prove something about me or whether I want to use my government. I should have the flexibility to do that in an ecosystem of attributes that we can put some standards around. That also doesn't exist at the moment. Verification and enrollment. I touched on enrollment a little bit earlier when I was talking about entitlement. But what we don't want to do is have people going through processes that are quite onerous when they don't need to. It should be a case that I prove who I am to a certain extent based on need, not based on entry into an identity system. Because as I said before, what's the reason why we have these things? It's because I want to access a service. So I should do what I need to do for that particular use. And over time, perhaps do other things, but don't do everything all up front, because that's another barrier for people. So how do I think we should design for all? One of the concepts that I'm sure a lot of you have heard is self-sovereign identity. Now, I have lots of problems with self-sovereign identity. In the first case, I don't believe you can be self-sovereign. I think you actually need governments and corporations to be able to provide evidence and proof about who you are, so that you can have trusted claims from authoritative sources. It's very difficult for me to prove who I am. Identity is usually not what I say about me, it's what other people say about me. And that's very important. That said, a lot of the concepts behind self-sovereign identity are very useful. It puts the user at the center, which is what I've been talking about, which is very important. It allows me to have control. It allows me to decide what credential I'm going to use, and then what claims, what trusted claims I'm going to use to prove who I am or to prove my eligibility for a particular service. And I think having that kind of self-managed identity platform and system is very, very important. And that's, for me, a big direction of travel that we need to go down. Good friend of mine, Andrew Nash, who is at Capital One now, he's the VP for Consumer Identity, I think is his title these days, came out with this phrase a few weeks ago, which I think is quite important, where he was talking about how identity systems are changing and where we should be going. And along the same themes of managed identity, he was talking about having an on-demand identity data instead of collect and keep. And what does he mean about that? Well, what he means is that rather than having a big silo of identity data that a government owns and looks after and curates, why not have it that I can point that service to whichever authoritative source I choose to use, which might be my government, but equally it might be my healthcare provider or my bank. It could be anything, as long as it's an authoritative source that follows standards. And there are some emerging standards around how we can look at what those claims look like and the metadata around those claims. NIST in the US have a very interesting document, which is NIST Internal Report 8112, if anybody's interested, which is all about metadata around attributes, which is a very interesting description of how you might create a system for describing how the quality of attributes and where they came from, how they were proven, so that when you provide an attestation or a proof from an authoritative source, you can consume in a standards-based way as a relying party, as a service, some information that helps you understand how to use that. And these are the kind of standards that we need in this world to achieve what Andrew's talking about here. Because I don't need to keep that data centrally. I can keep it in lots of different places, and the user is the focal point for that. So Steve Jobs famously once said this. He said, start with the user and work backwards. I think he recanted it at one point, but he did say it once. I think what we should really be looking at is start with the user and the relying party and work backwards. And what I mean by that is stop creating government identity systems just by looking at it from the government outwards. Look at the services that people want to consume and how they want to use identity and the barriers around them actually having those strong identities, and then work in. And then I think we'll get to the right answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adam. I think we already have a question.
Hi there. Thank you very much for the presentation. Would you be able to explain to us why the UK does not have a national ID? What are the benefits, the consumer, the user benefits of not having?
Not having a national digital identity?
Either.
Okay. So, all right, a little potted history of the UK. So no, we don't have a single identifier for an individual citizen in the UK. We actually have multiple. So I will have a national health number, I'll have a national insurance number. In fact, for taxation, I've probably got 3 or 4 different identifiers for me, because they come from different systems. There's a lot of systems and departments within the UK government that are literally archaic, some of which still run on paper. Some of the taxation systems still run on COBOL systems from the 70s. I mean, they're so hard to change. So we've got this ecosystem of identifiers. Many of them have been abused. The one that gets used the most is the national insurance number. And it's been picked up by banks and by insurers and all these kind of people who just ask for it as a kind of identifier for me. In the same way that it's been abused in the States, where the social security number just gets abused for everything all the time. Causes all sorts of problems, to the point where they are now just known secrets. They're out in the public domain, so they're not secret anymore. So we don't have a single identity in that respect. We don't have a register of citizens. We have lots of little silos of things that you can correlate. We did look at creating an ID card solution some years ago, which David, who's going to speak later, has all the scars for, which on paper looked like a very good solution. Many of the themes our Estonian colleague was talking about is we looked at, and what we wanted to do was create this thing nationally. It didn't work out. Why didn't it work out? Well, without going into too much detail, there was a huge uproar about how it might be misused for actually surveillance, mass surveillance. And that didn't go down particularly well with the privacy lobby. They brought the whole thing crashing down because of that. So we got to the point where it's almost will never happen in the UK now because of that. David can probably explain better than I can, but he lived it. But there was a huge report that came after that, which basically said, we're not doing this again, but we're going to learn from that. And the way we learned was we actually decided to create something that was based on lots of different proofs of who I am. And we created what is eventually became GovUK Verify, which was a project that both myself and David were involved in, which actually looks at multiple different sources across government and the private sector to figure out who an individual is. To the extent where there are 20,000 plus different routes I can take as an individual to prove who I am within that system, which is incredible because of the different data sources that we use. But to be able to do that, we had to figure out a whole bunch of standards that allowed the identity providers, who are all out in the private sector, to correlate identity and figure out on a scale, does that proof mean that I'm really who I say I am to a certain level of assurance? And that's proven to be reasonably effective, but it's not mandated. So we don't have, as we would in Estonia, not everybody has one of these things. They get one if they want one, which is highlighted to us some of the problems I've highlighted here, which is it becomes a barrier then, because unless you're forcing somebody to have a thing, they have to want to do it. And if you make it slightly difficult for them to do that, they're just going to do something else because there are other means. So it's figuring out that we should focus more on the users and the services is where all this has come from in many ways. That was a very long-winded, rambling answer, but hopefully that helps.
Just any question?
Thank you. I've seen in your CV that you were advising the World Bank on the digital identity.
Yes.
And they just have published a catalogue of standards in the field of ID. And
Indeed.
I saw that they completely ignored the European standards, the ETSI standards, the ITU ones. So I was wondering why.
Okay. Just for clarity, I didn't write that paper. As far as a lot of the ETSI standards are concerned, they will largely cross over with the ISOs, I believe. So that's possibly the reason for that. I think the other reason is that ISO standards tend to be more internationally recognized than ETSI standards. I've worked with ETSI in the past, so I'm quite familiar with that world, and it is a very European thing, for good reason, but doesn't translate very well internationally. People look to ISO and to NIST and to organisations like this because they just are generally more well known. Yes, we could probably include more standards in that, and that document I know has gone out for consultation, so if you do have any suggestions, it's a living document and more than happy to pass that back into the team who produced that document.
Just two quick question, Adam. You know the principle that you described, do you think the approach could be linked to cultural aspect as well? Like what you recommended would be a more, I would say, Anglo-Saxon approach, like Sanjay was referring, to common law and civil law, yes. Where in most countries of the world, including France and other, countries, where civil identity, we have a civil registry and we just issue an ID card which could be digitalized or...
Well, I'm not arguing against civil registries or ID cards, actually. What I'm saying is that great information that they've gathered under some really good processes is in itself siloed. And what would be great is if those silos were opened up by governments so that they could be used elsewhere. I mean, that's the trick to this. What I'm actually arguing for is for governments to continue what they're doing, but to be more open.
And the second question on the UK system, do you think if it had been made compulsory to receive a benefit or a service, it would have worked better? Or you really think that you need to wait 20 years that...
Maybe.
Or build incentives,
Maybe.
Because Estonia actually built incentives for people to use... They were compulsory... It was compulsory, there were incentives, just to... at the beginning at least, you know, to get
We
people on
we
board.
have used incentives before. So incentives were used by HMRC, who are our taxation department, when they first launched online tax returns. And I believe they made there was an incentive in the first tranche of that, which actually incentivized people getting, I think there was a small payment or a small rebate in your tax as a consequence. That hasn't been considered since. I think largely because it would cost quite a huge amount of money to do that across the whole nation. I think secondly, it's always been difficult to get departments to fund things like that. It was much easier for the taxation department because they have the lion's share of money coming into government. And they, at the time, it was quite some time ago, it predates a lot of the work we've done on identity, had some very tight targets on getting uptake in that system, because they actually removed the ability for people to do paper-based returns in many cases. So it became sort of a de facto method. So the pressures were different. Also, they didn't really focus on identity. It was more about filing a document rather than creating an identity. So different circumstances. So no, I don't think that would happen again. I don't think mandation would happen, because that would be seen as ID cards by the back door, which wouldn't sit particularly well politically, or from a privacy perspective in the UK.
Thank you. Any other question to Adam? Thank you very much, Adam. I will now call Deborah Comperin, who will present the Open API initiative by the Secure Identity Alliance. Deborah is chair of the Secure Identity Alliance ID for All work group and head this initiative. And in her spare time, she's senior market manager for IDEMIA.
Spare time, yeah. That's my real job, actually. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me well? Okay. So Stephanie introduced a little bit the Secure Identity Alliance, SIA, when she opened this session. And she briefly touched upon some of the initiatives we are working on. And this is actually one of those. So I'm going to present the Open API initiative. And basically, we are working on the interoperability issue. So before jumping straight to what we are doing, I decided to take you through the, let's say, the reasoning that we followed within the SIA to launch such initiative. So we started from the interoperability. We wanted to address this concern, this problem. And we wondered, okay, what is it? So maybe we should set the language before, because SIA basically is a multi-stakeholder organization. So they're not just people from the same organization sitting there. So we need to make sure that we speak the same language and we understand what the problem is. The second thing is there really no solution out there? So why are we even sitting here talking about this? And the third point is, if we decide that if we conclude that there's no solution out there, why should we care about it at all? So why do we need to go about solving this? So interoperability, actually you heard about this in all the previous presentations. So this diagram I'm going to show is actually similar to what Sanjay has shown in his presentation. So he actually pictured this in a triangle. It's actually the same thing but seen in a row. So his idea is to think of which are the components, the systems composing the ID ecosystem. So when we talk about national ID management system, what are the registries that we have? So we have the civil registry, basically manage the database managing the vital events of the population, so birth, death, and everything in between. Then we have what is called civil identification, so same language that actually also Sanjay used. So in here we have the database that could be population registry, collecting all the main attributes linked to individuals. We might or might not have an ABIS, that's up to the country. And then we have functional registries, which is this whole set of registries that collect different attributes and are basically working towards a defined function purpose. So it could be driving license, for instance, passport, election, etc. So altogether, this is what we call national ID ecosystem. And when we talk about interoperability, in very, very simple words, we need to make sure that every person is the same throughout every registry. This seems silly, but it's actually not an easy problem. So if I, Deborah, I exist in the civil registry, I need to be exactly the same person in all the rest of the registries. Also, it's about making sure that my attributes are actually up to date and are correct throughout. So this is what we are trying to achieve, basically. And to do this, we need these different databases to talk to one another. So we talk about interfaces. And this initiative, the Open API, is actually looking at interfaces among the different registries. So the point is there no solution today? So it's a common problem. I think it's quite important. So why are we here talking about it? So we try to think about open standards, what is out there. We know that ISO needs, we mentioned in previous presentation, there are so many organizations working on standards, but we can find some in a lot actually in civil identification. When it comes to the ABS system, we can find some civil registration. I would say a bit less on this one. But it's really hard to find open standard when it comes to interoperability among government registries. And this year, in April, I was at the ID for Africa conference, and they were distributing an almanac. And in one of these, the initial part of the almanac, there was this, I took actually this table from there. And this is showing, it was an attempt to organize all the different standards existing today. And this gives a proof of how important it is for governments to try to understand what is available out there, and also what you can use to make sure, if you see there are interoperability mentioned here and there, to make sure that you achieve interoperability among the systems. And another work actually is we mentioned it earlier, the one of World Bank, that is they are trying to classify all the different standards. So what if we do not work on it? So we say, there's something missing there. What if we just neglect it? And here in simple words, I would like to explain what could happen. So why it's important to work on interoperability and on open standard for interoperability. So the first point is that interoperability is closely linked with vendor lock-in. So it's one of the components of vendor lock-in. It's not the only issue, but it's one of the major ones. So if we do not work, if we make it easy for companies to actually use proprietary technologies and actually link the different systems with proprietary interfaces, it's going to be easier to lock in customers. So again, ID for Africa made a survey this year, and basically asked several questions. One of those questions was about implementation satisfaction. And actually, the issue number one was vendor lock-in, and that was linked to interoperability. And that was true for both the Francophone and Anglophone countries, which is quite a result, because normally if you look at the rest of the questions, you get a different perspective between the two parts, but not in this one. And then the second thing is, when you don't have interoperability, then it might be a bit easier to fall into the trap of building a big database and collecting more data than what you actually need, when the idea would be to segregate data. So every government agency, every database shall just collect the data that they truly and actually need, and not more than that. And if you have interoperability, then you can verify your exchange. So this is about privacy, which is linked to also what Adam was mentioning just before me, and putting the user at the center. And actually, like he said, starting from the user, what the user really need, and work backwards. So what is the initiative about? It's about building an open standard, an interface to connect civil registry and civil identification. So I talk about interoperability in general, I talk about all the different registries. I said that there's something missing there, but we don't want to boil the ocean. So as a starting point, we started between civil registry and civil identification. So we are linking these two. I want to try to explain it in a bit of in a concrete manner. So I'm gonna go through a use case so that you can see what exactly we're doing. So this is, by the way, everything that I'm saying is in GitHub. So everything we are doing is published. You will see it later. So you can go and see, and you can also contribute. Let's look at this use case. So the birth. I want to stress that we decided to start with civil registry because sometimes it is a component that is neglected in today in ID ecosystem, but it's actually quite important. I mean, it might not be implemented in all countries, but in some countries it is part of that system. So we look at the birth use case, so registering a birth, and here you have three main parts of the use case. So you have the first one, which is check. So you might have mother or father or whoever is registering the birth. We need to check to authenticate, might need to authenticate those people. We need to just check some of their attributes, or we need just to import some of those attributes from an existing registry, like the ID card or like population registry, for instance. And the second part is the identity creation, because with the birth, we register for sure the event in the civil registry, but normally this should trigger also the existence of the person in the population registry. So the person should be inserted at that point. And we envisage that in both registries, the person should exist with the same unique identifier. So the principle lies behind our interface is actually that person have a unique identifier throughout the different registries. And then the third part is notification. So actually, you can, in the CI part, you can get some of the attributes that you need from the civil registry and create the identity of the person. On purpose, we have the unique, somewhere there, we have the unique, the generator of the unique identifier. On purpose, we did not place it neither in the civil registry, neither in the CI part, because that's a choice of the country. So we didn't want to place it either in one or the other registry. So once we see this is a use case, we have many, like these ones, and as you enter in each one of those boxes, you have a set of services. So the idea now is to pick one by one all those services and develop. Like, for example, this one. So this one is match person attributes, so I just took the first one in the line. And so we are starting to develop the functional documents around this. So this, again, you can find it in GitHub. And I'm not gonna, it's not the goal of today to get into the details, but you can see in here which are the data that we exchange. So what goes in, what goes out for every service. What is the data model, so the data type and structure, and how we exchange the data between the two registries, etc. And this is also, we have for every service, we have a technical documentation where you can find all the details here. This is an initial proposal, of course. We have other use cases, but the main point and the main message for me today is not really about how this works and the technicalities of the API, but it's actually to say that this is something that we should all do as an identity community. And so this is why we decided to publish everything in GitHub. So it's an initial proposal, and we welcome all of you to have a look at what we are doing, to contribute. If you want to join the group, feel free to join the group. It's very important that we all work together, because interoperability, it's a common problem. It's not just a government problem. Us as industry, we need to make sure that we implement certain technical solutions to make sure that this doesn't happen anymore. And the user should always be at the center of what we're doing. And this is why also, for me, it's important that development agencies are part of this, are part of the work, because they can bear in mind all these, the privacy concerns, and they are doing quite a lot of extensive work on that. So I think it's important to have their input as well. So the page is I don't know what I've done. The page is open in GitHub, so you can go and see is a link to Secure Identity Alliance, SIA. And in there you will find, you can go through the menu, you will find the functional specifications. There are all the different use cases. I just show you one. Then you can get into all different details, and then there will be the technical specification for all the different services, and you can have a look in there. We don't have the answer for everything, so you will find some open questions in that page. So we have started the development, but we actually ask questions to the community to see what you think about it and how you can contribute. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Deborah. We have one question.
Deborah, thank you so much for your presentation. So I have a two-part question for you. First of all, given this initiative is meant to ease interoperability and make life easier for both governments and end users and so on, maybe also to help to reduce total cost of ownership of a lot of these ID systems. Now, my question would be, for this initiative, what kind of pushback do you think you maybe either envisage or are getting at the moment from those who wish to protect, yes, in their own defense, their R&D, their proprietary technologies and so on? What kind of pushback are you getting against this open standard that is being developed? That's number one. Then the second part of my question would be, seeing as almost anyone can join the community and contribute towards the development of this open standard, is there a particular committee or subcommittee that reviews all these different proposals that are being put in, and who then decides what gets put in and what is eventually rejected? Thank you.
Okay, I will start from answering your second part of the question, which is easier. So yes, there is we are establishing an advisory committee, and we have an external moderator, which is an external consultant and is not member of any of the companies or organizations part of SIA. So he's the person that is taking all the comments, and he's managing the comments, and also basically he makes a summary of all of these and is presenting them to the advisory committee. And in that advisory committee, the members, by the way, is open to everyone, can actually discuss those comments, and then those are implemented within GitHub. But actually, nothing prevents from a single person to subscribe to GitHub and then comment or contribute. First question is a very tough one. And I have to be honest here. The pushback was because interoperability is linked to vendor lock-in. So I think it's a tough subject. It's a tough subject for everyone, including industry. So I think now we reached, and I'm quite proud of saying this, we reached the point where we understood industry is actually working together towards this, that this is not the way to move forward. So it's time to open our systems with open standard API and make sure that they are interoperable with one another. And it's not, like I said, usually to customer, I don't think that the value of what industry proposes lies in vendor lock-in. Actually, technology is great, service is great, and we don't need to leverage or to rely on that to stick to a customer. So I think there's a major shift in the mindset, especially in industry, and I think this is the confirmation of that. So the pushback, I would say, the beginning was in making this shift. And I would say it's, unless you want to add something, I would say this is the major pushback. The other component is that I would like development organizations and the development world in general to look at what we are doing and to contribute, even if this is an initiative that started from SIA. I think we need to understand that we need to work together. This is not an industry problem, this is not a government problem, this is not a citizen problem. So it's time for us to sit down and try to work on this together. So this is the other part that I'm trying to insist a lot on.
Maybe I will be in front here. My name is Bernard Morvan. I'm from the consulting company Sophie. I am also a member of the Secure Identity Alliance, but I do also a lot of work with the government throughout the world on the ID program. So I want to help Deborah in answering also the very important question you ask about, yeah, but what about the potential vendor pushback, or vendor lock-in, pushback. I think it's also good to recognize that today most of these quote-unquote vendors are focused also on one part of the ID ecosystem, which is mainly the civil identification, border control and so forth. But to the best of my knowledge, and I work on this every single day, I'm not aware of any single vendor so far who is specialized in the development and modelization of civil registry system. Wherever I go, in Africa, in the Caribbean, everywhere, everybody say, yeah, Bernard, I want to modernize my civil registry system. Today, as you know, most of them are paper-based, even in countries, like France and many other ones in Europe. So in fact, there is no major vendor. So when we have discussion among the vendor community, you say, okay, so what is the opportunity here? You know that most of the development banks are pushing very hard, rightly so, to make sure that at least, the foundational component, which is, civil registry, is modernized through a number of processes, to get that at least electronized, because it will help for a number of initiatives. So then you have to be very pragmatic and say, well, either, we get together and we define a model, which is the one which is presented by Deborah, interoperability, and then you have a better chance, to achieve your objective. Otherwise, everybody will keep on fighting on one piece of the action, which might be, civil identification. But today, this is not where the market is going. I've done already myself with government authority 5, unique ID number, program around the world. And what, goes underneath, which was also explained by Sanjay, is the fact that you want to get rid of these silos. And today, obviously, there is a silos of civil registry versus identification. But most important, you want to streamline, the way authorities, manage the identity. So the opportunity is huge, and none of the companies I know of, in this industry has also the bandwidth, also to do all this work. So the only way to make it happen is to focus a lot of energy on interoperability, so that also you can explain it, to the state authorities. They are more comfortable with it, and then they move on. The other side of vendor lock-in, for me, if you want to elaborate also a bit more on that, for me, has to do also from the state perspective. How do they look at this project, and what is the level of energy and effort they are ready to put in, so that they have also a very good and detailed description. Thanks, because I had the light, in front of my eyes, so I could not see you. So you see, so to make sure also that the system, your requirement basically, are described in a way so that it will help also, the vendors to respond correctly, to that. And because again, I work with government authority, it's difficult. It's a tough process. So as soon as I can refer to the model which were displayed, I say, look, now there is the ecosystem, you have an interoperability model, so this is what you have to ask for. And it could be done in different steps, priority. So you could say, well, because, 2020, I have the election, so I need to make sure that I know I need to reissue my cards or whatever. So you may start with that, and then you know, you will move along gradually, you know, civil registry, because civil registry modernization is tough and long. This is not something you can do overnight. So my point here, you know, these activities in each, you know, environment, you know, has also maybe different, you know, cycles of implementation. And I strongly believe that this model can achieve that. And I will stop there.
Thank you, Bernard. Thank you very much. We have another question.
I'm Nat Sakimura, chairman of the OpenID Foundation. I have two questions. What is the buy-in of the governments in the process? Or what is your go-to-market strategy with this specifications? And the second question is, what is the IPR mode of the specification that you are creating?
So the buy-in, or well, go-to-market strategy, slightly different, but we think that the main concern for governments is vendor lock-in, and so interoperability is, like I said, is just one of the factors of vendor lock-in, but it's one of the major ones. And so this is where the need is coming from, and this is how we, let's say, market such initiative, and that's how we present it to governments. And it's not by any means just something that we as SIA or anybody contributing is just pushing. I think, and I want to stress on the thing that it's a collaborative effort. So actually I would like also governments to be involved, to review and to read about this and contribute, maybe not technically if that's they can't contribute technically, but at least in some principles. So this is their need, but it's a work in progress, and it's a work we should all do together. And I can't answer your second question today, so we can talk later about that.
Yeah. Mm. We can thank you very much, Deborah.
Yeah.
I'm told that we are running a little bit late, so we'll move to our next speaker, but that I haven't met personally. I would like you to welcome Mr. Aliyu Abubakar Aziz, who is the CEO of the National Identity Management Commission of Nigeria. Thank you very much for joining us, and it's a real honor to have you here to present Nigeria's plans.
Okay, good afternoon. I'm presenting the strong identity for strong e-governance, and I believe that there is strong correlation between the identity and e-governance, a case study for Nigeria. This is the outline. I'll talk about the nation, Nigeria itself, then talk about the world economy at a glance, and world health also at a glance, and talk also on the sustainable development goals. Already Sanjay gave us a background of that, and e-governance at a glance, then where we are in what we have been doing in Nigeria, and then the strategic roadmap that we work with World Bank, AFD, which is the French Development Agency, and also EU, that we work on an ecosystem and the potentials of that system and the outcome that we observe. So this Nigeria, first of all, we have like 36 states and the FCT, federal capital, so making 37 states, 774 local government areas. Population is close to 200 million now. So compared to Estonia, you can see the size. And then apart from that, we have like 371 ethnic groups with almost more than 500 different languages. So you can imagine the complexity of the society. Even if you have an AI, you can imagine how deep the layers that you can use to manage 500 languages. And we are the most populous black nation. Population annual growth by UNICEF is every year we add 7 million children. That is population of Rwanda every year. And there is high percentage of young labor force, and we are technology enthusiasts and users too. So at a glance, this is what I found at 80 trillion world economy in just one chart. You can see the United States of America. The green is the whole of the Europe. The blue is Asia. And then somewhere purple down there, there are 3 countries. That is Nigeria with 0.47%, South Africa and Egypt representing the world. So in terms of economy, though there may be a lot of comments on it, but it represents something that in that proportion. When you talk of economy, again, we have this chart from Gapminders by late Rosalind, and he drew on the vertical axis how healthy a nation is, on the horizontal is how rich that country is. And you can see most of the yellow, that is the European countries, are here with some other Arab countries. Way back in the 60s, we were all down there, and some have gotten some policies right and moved to this. So Nigeria is somewhere down there with Pakistan, India, and the rest of them. The size of the bulb is the size of population. So Sustainable Development Goals, Sanjay have already talked about that. Item 16, peace, justice, and also strong institutions. And it's also related with other parts of the social development goals, like the social protection 1.3, rights to economic resources and universal health coverage and everything else. So therefore, identity is deep-rooted and is so fundamental to whatever that we do. In Nigeria, we have what we call economic recovery and growth plan, and it has to do with investing in the people, restoring growth, and then being global competitive. And you can see that there will be digital economy there, and we believe that it must be driven by skilled workforce, digital payments, and internet. But at the platform is the unique identity that needs to drive this economic growth. On e-governance, simply, it has been around since 90s, the use of information and communication technology to enhance access to and delivery of government services to the benefit of citizens, businesses, and employees. And it has to be citizen-centered, result-oriented, and market responsiveness. So where have you been? So far, this our national EID that we produce is 5 years now. We have about 13 applets. It's one of the base cards that we designed, and we activated 5 of them for travel, the EPKI, match on card, payments, and also the EID. We have many other ones that are there. Again, there's wide acceptance of the card by the citizen because everybody seems to like the card. But because of recession and other problems, we are unable to do much on this. So far we just printed 1.5 million cards only. So like we are still in the pilot mood for a population of 200 million, and is for citizens that are 16 years and above, but we enroll everybody. So this is the card, our next card, that is the national EID 2.0 applets, in which we want to concentrate on the EID, and also now that we will work as an ecosystem with immigration, payments, and the telcos. So this is what we intend to do in future. But right now, we concentrate on the enrollment. And this is the history of the enrollment. Way back down there, we have 7 million in 2015. We doubled that to 14 in 2016. We doubled it again last year. Right now, we are at 33 million. We were hoping to commence the ecosystem approach, which I'll explain. But these are the data in all the local government areas that we have. Again, we use our flag, green, white, green metaphor. White areas is where we don't have data, much data, and the more green it is, the more data we collected. Again, you may think that there is no story there, but there's so much intelligence in it. All the white areas means like this upper right-hand corner is where we have security problems. So there's no data that is being captured. But on the left-hand side, that is broadband. There's no broadband. So all the people that capture data have to come back to the capital to send the data. And some of the areas there are along the bank of the rivers where there's infrastructure difficulty and the rest of them. That is what the data talks about. So this is the strategic roadmap. Again, you can see that the target, that is our vision, a lifelong ID for all. That is every individual physically present in Nigeria and Nigerians that are living abroad. So our highest body, the Federal Executive Council, endorsed this in September 2018. And these are the key characteristics that, again, that is what we've been talking about so far, because we work with World Bank, AFD, and EU, the same principle. It has to be digital. So we are using the National Identification Number, that is NIN, we call it. It has to be unique. We must use biometrics to make it unique. Minimally, only 10 data fields. Currently, we collect about 83 fields, so we have to now reduce it to 10 fields only, so that it will be minimal, so that other people in the ecosystem will be able to capture the same data. Foundational, verified across all the agencies, and civil registration linkages of the birth and death registration. That is what we just talked about. Again, we want to be technology neutral to avoid vendor lock-in, because we had so much experience of vendor lock-in, but not only the vendors too, even the agencies themselves also wants to issue contract, and then they will get a vendor that will say, don't worry about them, I'll give you something else. And then at the end of the day, it's locked in. Then trustworthy, built with legal, technical, and security safeguards to ensure data protection and the privacy. And it has to be rolled out using the ecosystem approach. And this is the, this is the ecosystem approach, that at the center, all the agencies will capture the data at federal level, state level, local government, private sector, and even civil society. At the back end there, that is NIMSI, will only store the core data for ID. We set standards and certified field operators and regulate this particular system. Then we provide, each one of these one will provide services to the individual. We also have it in this form where we show that NIMSI is becoming more of a regulator than capturing data. And then we have super partners. These are government agencies like population, central bank, and private sector to connect to the people. And NIMSI will only facilitate collecting biometric data. Partners collect data and are paid per successful enrollment. So this is a new model. It is not a contract, it's not a PPP, but a performance-driven system. And because of this, we also come up with a lot of regulations that which the government also signed as gazettes, which we put on our website. That is the address up there, that for further references. Then we also shared the responsibilities, because we have many government agencies. Before we were not working together. Now we agreed. All the agencies sat down and agreed. Population Commission will register birth, issue birth certificate, collect data, and also register death. NIMSI will only regulate the data. We are not collecting data because we are regulating now. We store the data, issue a unique number, regulate credentials, and verify the ID. All others can collect data and also do their own functional activities. We agreed that Population Commission and NIMSI are the foundational identities. All others are functional. And this has been accepted and also passed by the government. So the strategic options that we come up with at a glance, we come up with 4 options. The first one is like what we are doing now. Only one agency enrolling. We have more than 70 fields. That is the 83 fields that we capture. If we are to concentrate and take 3 years to capture the data, and even add 2 more years to make sure that everybody is captured. What we don't have is that, similar to our colonial masters, that is the UK, that you don't have a national ID. The same thing with Nigeria too. There was no culture of enrolling everybody. All the other francophone countries in Africa do have very strong culture of identity. Therefore, we want to spend like 3 years to make sure that everyone is captured. Then the second scenario is that we have 20 fields. We reduce the 70 plus fields to 20 fields because, again, there is a study on the Indian model that if you have 10 fields and you double the fields, then you will double the cost. The cost of capturing the data, storing it, transmitting, processing it, and also keeping it in future. So, in terms of credentials, we issue digital ID now and smart card. The same thing with all. On scenario 3, the only difference is that we now give a simple card without maybe the chip to reduce the cost, which we said, knowing us, Nigerians, it will be difficult to manage that kind of card. So we are not going there. So we want to start with scenario 4. That is an ecosystem approach whereby we issue only the digital ID for the next 3 years. So this is the options, and we selected scenario 4. Again, this the infrastructure guys that come up with complex system, but it's just to make sure that we have a distributed identity database and also use high technology to make sure that at any time that they send data, it does not take long time to then generate the national identification number. So the potentials are so much in each of the sectors: financial inclusion, women empowerment, or social safety net, education, voting. A digital identity is like a platform, and I believe that all of you agrees with that. So our takeaway is that There is a strong relationship between the identification and e-governance, and this is central in realizing effective delivery of important government services to the people. And all modern economic services are done digitally and rely on good identification in order to promote the economic growth and opportunities. And unlocking these opportunities require establishment of the right regulatory and industry policies to encourage infrastructure investment like communication networks, creation of stable and predictable commercial environment, stimulation of the demand for also the digital solution, and provide digital identity to everyone in the country. That is proving who is who, because the challenge is knowing who is critical. So for Nigeria to achieve strong digital identity for strong e-governance, we need to teach our children to well, of course, using technology, restart the startups themselves or reboot them and upgrade our infrastructure. So all these are opportunities again for trusted partners. In all, we need to build the trust and for dependability, accessibility, transparency, and integrity. And beyond that, there have to be convenience in the digital ID for governance to connect all the functional identities that we talked about with the national identification number. And finally, the value for us in developing countries is to provide basic services for reasonable standard of living. And we don't take for granted food, energy, housing, drinking water, sanitation, healthcare, education, social security. All these are basic services, and whenever we talk of digital identity or e-governance, these are the values that we want for the majority teeming members of our society. So many key partners, from the global solution providers at the back end to the cards that we have, payment platform back end, others including the World Bank, AFD, and the AIB of the EU. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. Any question? I suggest you are staying with us until the end. We can move on to our next presentation and then conclude with Estelle Massé on civil society and take more questions with all our speakers. I had a question, but we are running so late. So I'd like to introduce you to David Rennie, who is the ex-head of the private sector REACH program within the UK Gov Connect. Yeah? You were in charge of, and you left government last year to join private sector again?
I left earlier this year, yes.
Earlier this year.
Yeah, so I worked on the identity card and then on the scheme that followed it. So
that's right. And David is going to present a project within Horizon 2020, which is really using a trusted, strong ID, across border in Europe, in the case of EIDAS. The floor is yours, David.
Thank you. So all the buzzwords, I think, have been used this afternoon, so I'll try to avoid going over them again. This is to report on a project which was commissioned whilst I was working for the UK government. A very different environment. We're working with the UK banks on opening a bank account overseas. Just a quick hands up, has anybody ever opened an account in a country that they don't come from? Was it easy or difficult? Difficult? In the UK, the banks estimate that typically it takes about 3 months to open a bank account, And so our goal here was to say, well, how can we use eIDAS to cut that down to 10 minutes? That's the project which I'll describe, and then I'll also talk about the initiative that's now coming out of the European Commission to create a KYC attributes framework. There's the digital single market. The concept for eIDAS is to remove the friction. There's one of the buzzwords around trade in the digital single market. Digital identity, creating trust across borders, actually inhibits people transacting across borders because it is difficult to create trust across borders, and digital identity is a means of addressing that. So the opening of a bank account is a great example of establishing trust and the challenges of creating trust. So in the project we have HSBC, Barclays Bank, ourselves, IDEMIA, Orange France, the UK Government Digital Service, and the Open Identity Exchange. And so I've played for two of those parts in the lifetime of this project, GDS and now IDEMIA. A lot of text there, but the key premise, actually since we started the project, after quite a lot of lobbying, the fifth Anti-Money Laundering Directive now recognises digital identity standards under eIDAS as being appropriate for opening a bank account. And that's a huge step, because from a compliance officer perspective in a bank, it's all very well saying we've got this great digital identity thing, but until they see that being recognised by regulators as being appropriate for opening a bank account, there's great reluctance to experiment in the space. So that's very important. As I said, our goal was to take a bank, we called it any bank in order to be neutral. We're building a prototype, it's not actually being adopted into the services, the actual onboarding process for HSBC and Barclays. We hope to move the project forward into that stage after completing this. But we were looking at how do we actually get the data into a system that is in a trustworthy manner, so that the compliance officer can be happy to open an active bank account through the application process that can be used immediately on completing the application. So that's the goal, and that's why we see the sort code and account number there being provided to the customer at the end of the transaction. We have a video, so you can watch the video, and if anybody has been through a process and would like to conduct the survey, we've got a link to the survey there. I don't know if there's a means of getting hold of the slides subsequently, but if not, you could take a photo of that if you wanted to complete the survey. We'd be very grateful. But I'm not going to step you through that process. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what we've done. So there are a number of considerations, of course, and trustworthy data is really the one I would like to focus on. How you actually pass data in a digital transaction from a customer, an applicant for a bank account, to a bank in a way that can be trusted by the bank. I'll describe what the solution architecture is. There are papers that we're going to publish, and we have published some of these on liability. That is always the sticking point from a bank perspective. If they're going to be relying on this data, how does this change their liabilities? What liabilities do they have, and how would that change under this model, and what would the regulator say? The commercial model is critical. If we're going to open up trustworthy data, as is implied by the General Data Protection Regulation, which now gives everybody the right to access their data and use their data, and they have the right of portability, so they can take their data from one organisation to another. If that's going to happen, what's the commercial basis for it? If value has been created with one bank and that data is being passed to another bank, how is value moving, and how is the first bank that's invested in creating the value in that data, how is it being compensated? The user experience, again, we've talked about during the course of the day, that's critical. The challenges with implementation and the challenges of governance, all topics that we've looked at in the course of the project. So trustworthy data is the key piece I'd like to talk about. If we have personal data residing in, for example, a bank in France, we looked at opening a bank account in the UK based on data coming from France. if that bank has data, how can that data be ported across to another bank and linked to a digital identity in a way that establishes trust in the data? That is really the nub of the challenge. And to do that, we used a protocol, the User Managed Access Protocol, based on OAuth and OpenID Connect. It's reusing existing technical protocols, but it's effectively a sequence and a logical description of the different actors that will be required and the sequences of messages between those different parties in order to get permission from the customer or the user for the data to move from party A to party B. So that's an open standard. You can read about that on the internet at the Kantara website, and that's what we deployed. We used UMA-based products from ForgeRock to show how this would work in practice. The trust anchor for this, the digital identity is the part that all parties in the transaction recognize because it's established under eIDAS and are prepared to trust. And the parties there being obviously the party standing up the data, the party that is receiving the data, and also the customer himself. So that's a very a simplification of what the service looks like. Fundamentally, it is a customer interacting with the bank. As I say, we called it any bank, and that is the basis of the transaction. When we were looking at the user experience, the banks were quite insistent that the predominant user experience would be between the customer and that bank. That is the bank that they're applying to. But we have a number of other service providers in the transaction as well. So we have a number of different brands and a really quite complicated mechanism underneath the covers. So one of the big challenges that we have in the project is how do we describe this journey? How do we take the customer on this journey in a way that isn't going to scare and confuse the customer? In the case of the French national identity system, that's a system called France Connect. We actually have Orange, who is the authentication provider under France Connect. We have IDEMIA playing a small part of that as a service provider, connecting the different parties together. And we have data coming from a data provider. Maybe that's Orange as a bank, acting as a bank in France. So we designed a user journey that enabled that, again, available to watch in the video. Describing the part that IDEMIA plays in this, something we called the Blue Service as a prototype name. We have a number of permanent, semi-permanent relationships that the customer has. So I have my digital identity with one party. I might even be a digital citizen of Estonia, for example. But my digital identity is recognized and trusted. My personal data might reside with what we call an attribute provider. That might be with a bank in France. I have other bits of data that are also pertinent when establishing trust that I will want to be in control of. I want to share this data with an organization, in this case, any bank. Now, under GDPR, there are different lawful bases of processing for that data, and I have the right to move that data from party A to party B. So how do we provide the consent mechanisms? Consent is a shorthand, it's just one of the lawful bases of processing. How do we provide a service that enables the customer to control that and release that data to the organization? And when the organization has received that data, they have to be able to understand it in their risk model. And that means it needs to be described in a way in terms of the metadata and the constructs of the data in a way that can be interpreted by the receiving organization. So a number of complexities in all of that, all of them resolvable, but as was said earlier in the day, most of the challenges are not in the technology space, but in the governance space and in getting the agreement between organizations to use the same language. So that was really what I was going to say about the project. It comes to a conclusion at the end of this year, and we'll be publishing the reports on the Open Identity website, and I think the European Commission will publish them as well. And we'll be looking forward to take that project forward into the next phase, which will be a real deployment in the new year. But we haven't got anything to announce on that as yet. But meanwhile, in parallel, in Brussels, an expert group has been set up, which is looking at a concept of KYC attributes and establishing a framework for KYC attributes. And the reason for that is because essentially, year on year, if you can read many a report, money laundering and criminal finance grows year on year in the digital space, or it is growing generally, I'm sure, exacerbated by the ease of digital transactions. The response is to tighten regulations year on year. We've had 2 revisions to the money laundering regulation in 3 years. And the approach of tightening regulations is not working. We need a different model. And that requires, as has been said before, greater collaboration between the organizations who are really hemorrhaging a lot of money trying to stop fraud and chasing their tails, searching through data, more and more data, to try and detect the good guys from the bad guys. We need a different approach, and we believe that an approach where the customer has to play a greater part in providing trustworthy information is important to that. To be able to do that, for the customer to be able to share data between one party and another, we need to have standard definitions for the types of data that would be moved across. And for most banks, they are collecting the same type of information in each bank when they open a bank account. So why can we not standardize what that information is and create some standards around the definition and trust levels associated with that data? So that's what the expert group is doing. I think it concludes in March of next year. And it is looking to work on the same sorts of logical construct as EIDAS, so in thinking about levels of assurance. What we are always going to be doing is providing information that can be interpreted and people can make decisions on. We're not going to be safeguarding a third party and saying it's okay to do any particular transaction. It will always be the user of that data who has to understand it and make their own risk-based decisions. And yes, that's all I was going to say. In terms of next steps, as I said, we move to putting this into effect during 2019. We will publish details of that when it happens. It will be between a small number of banks because it's not easy to do this work and it's very difficult if you've got large numbers of people in the room, so much better to start with a small number of banks and to grow it. But likewise, we need to have the means of communicating what's going on so that others can observe and respond and get involved in due course. I think I may have caught up some time, but any questions?
Thank you very much. So Connecting Europe facility is a European program. My question is, what about if an African citizen wants to open an account in a European bank? In the case he has an EIDAS a recognized identity. In the case he has one of the bank in the consortium, such as Orange. So what is your plan to make, I would say, not internal market not internal European market, but African European connections?
Yeah, so EIDAS is it is a European regulation, but it was very much written, and Adam is here, was part of the creation of it. It was very much written to be extensible, so beyond Europe. Indeed, European United Kingdom. We're big proponents of it. Who knows whether we'll be in or out in a little while. So we've been talking with the Canadians about doing it exactly as you say, looking at a Canadian citizen coming into the UK or coming into Europe. So there's no reason why it should be constrained. It is complicated, and it is better to start somewhere with a small number of parties and grow. So that's very much our philosophy. But ultimately, once the basics are in place, we should be able to scale it quickly.
I got two questions actually. Number one, what will be something you mentioned already? What will be the effect of the Brexit into this development? Will it be same? We're gonna have the same situation after or before? And the second one, I was just a month before, I was in Riga, in Latvia, to open for clients of befriended lawyers, actually, companies and company accounts, and it was even with proper documents not possible to open banking accounts, even if you're on the banking counter. How? I mean, what I mean is there are two different levels. One is the digital level, and the other one is the real banking sector, which is regulated in every country in a different way, still.
Yeah. So on the Brexit thing, I've definitely got my head in the sand, and I'm convinced it's not going to happen. But that's my answer there. But you know, should it happen, the need for interoperability for the UK, you know, is greater. You know, we're not going to have much fun on our own, sitting there talking to ourselves. So we'll need to interoperate with other countries, and we'll need to be able to do that in the digital space. So we are notifying under EIDAS. So we will be recognised under the EIDAS scheme at a European level, even after Brexit. Adam tells me that they're going to be discussing identity in the House of Commons on Saturday, I think he said. So, so it's you know, in an increasingly digital world, being able to assert a digital identity from the UK will be you know, of fundamental importance. In terms of the complexity of the subject, I mean, it is enormously complex. We've started with quite a simple product, which is a current account, which, as I say, typically in the UK takes about 3 months to open once you arrive in the UK. We've been looking at how you can, for that particular product, how you could address that. Once you've got the basics in place, and once you've got the logic in place, most importantly, once you've got the regulators understanding the logic, and you've got the commercials in place that mean that people will offer up their data because they can see the business case for them working together. Once those things are in train, then it becomes possible to solve problems. But you have to start with something very simple and then look to scale it once you've got agreement. I can't see if there are any hands up, so...
Right here, sorry, spotlight. I'll ask a simple question. Hopefully you'll enjoy answering it. I have an Italian passport, I live in the UK, and I just happen to be a customer of Barclays and HSBC. You're from the UK, I'm sure you're aware of the challenger banks. What is the difference? Explain it to a millennial. Why does it take 2 weeks to open a bank account with Barclays or HSBC, but only 2 to 5 minutes? What's the difference? What's
risk? Risk. So it's we have at the moment, the banks operate a risk model. So they have they make a decision based on the customer coming to them, whether they should open an account and how quickly they should open an account, and what evidence they require to open that account, and whether the process that they have adopted within that bank is satisfactory to meet the regulations. And you know, for incumbent banks who've built up processes over years and years and years and have built one regulation on top of another regulation on top of another regulation, you know, they're building on you know, quite a process. For a new bank coming in and starting from scratch, it might be easier to you know, establish a risk model that is acceptable. But it comes down to individual banks and ultimately what risks they're prepared to take for particular products, for particular customer demographics.
Fantastic, thank you. And second part of the questions, are the incumbent banks, is it on their strategy map to simplify things?
I think it is. I mean, the fact that they're participating in those two banks, and in the UK at least, there are a number of initiatives going on around the banks looking at digital identity, not just from the perspective of opening accounts for onboarding customers. I would say the bigger challenge is the actual ongoing customer due diligence around how you actually continue to know that the data you're getting about your customers is correct data. You know, the banks spend a huge amount of money checking these things, and the systems have all been designed, not the technology systems, but the processes have all been designed around the analog world, the paper-based world, and they have to rapidly change.
Thank you very much, David. This was really interesting, and we can see for an easy user experience and makes complicated project. Thank you very much. I'm going to invite Estelle Massé, who is Senior Policy Analyst and Global Data Protection Lead at Access Now. Access Now is a civil society organization. So Estelle is going to conclude that day, because I don't think there's any need for me to repeat all I've heard, from all those experts. But it's really interesting to have, your speech now and your comments, coming from civil society on all the things we've heard today. And it was good that civil society was quoted at least twice in the e-governance importance of the process.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, and thank you for the invitation to speak today. Before I start, just allow me to say a few words about Access Now. As mentioned, we're a civil society organization, and you probably don't see a lot of us or our partners to this type of conference normally, even though we work on those issues extensively, and we hope to cooperate more in the future in this discussion. So Access Now is an international organization that has a mission to defend and extend the digital rights of users at risk around the world. We work globally to advance meaningful protection for users and their rights in the digital era. Within the organization, I coordinate our global data protection work, and I have the opportunity to work with my colleagues in the development of norms around the world, which also means that I'm not the digital ID expert within the organization, but none of my colleagues who works on it could be here today, so I'm hoping that I'll do a good job in representing the position we've worked forward on this issue. I'll try to be brief on my presentation because I realized that it was quite a lengthy afternoon, and I was really happy to hear already a lot of mention regarding privacy and strong governance in a lot of the previous speakers' presentation, which is not always a reflection of what we see in the digital ID discussion at government level. So in the presentation, I'll try to explain the perspective of the individuals in the development and use of digital ID programs, and explain how those programs need to put human at the center, be based around rights, and how civil society participation can help deliver those goals. Over the past years, we have observed that certain interests and coalitions are pushing for aggressive national digital ID program at international and national level, often through public and private partnership, and they're trying to force digital ID into becoming the main foundation block for all digital services and online activities. Most of these discussions are generally barely addressing the cost of such program that they impose on individuals, whether it's a cost in terms of rights or in terms of access. Oftentimes, there is not even a public debate on the launch of such programs, which are presented as a sort of fait accompli to the population. Yet, such programs expose people to risk for their human rights. They can undermine their right to privacy and data protection, which was already mentioned today. They can also chill freedom of movement and of expression and other protected rights. There is also significant risk for cybersecurity and information disclosure if those are not addressed properly in the building of the programs. There are even higher risk for programs that are using biometric as fundamental authentificators. Biometrics are absolute qualities that are unchangeable, which means that if there is an abuse on those data, there is no going back. We recognize that digital ID program may be useful for government to organize public services and generate revenues for industry, but the current debate does not sufficiently address and adequately address the impact on people's lives and rights, and people must be at the center of this discussion. Public discourse and court rulings in India and Europe have led to the recognition of the need to ensure that human rights are at the center of this discussion. But there is still a gap to be bridged into this recognition that is starting to grow and actual translation into action of how to do so. This is where civil society can help. There is a need for upscaling civil society engagement and coordination and ensuring continuous focus on human rights in the creation of those digital ID programs, as well as in suggesting human rights respecting approach to digital identity. Many of our groups are actually also tech-based and tech experts. We can help develop standards and ensure that existing standards of privacy by design or security by design are embedded in the development of digital ID program. Part of our role as civil society is to provide constructive alternatives and proposals by pushing for more human rights respective approach to digital identity. I will very quickly run you through 5 large areas which encompass some of the proposals we have, which are on governance, cybersecurity, privacy and data protection, transparency, and general human rights protection. First, on governance. We believe that government should not mandate the use of digital ID. We should have an option to say no to any demand that have a digital ID without prejudice of negative repercussion. The use of digital ID must be clearly defined and restricted in law. It's important to ensure purpose limitation in use. One single digital identity used for identification of multiple contexts creates the potential for pervasive surveillance and profiling. And yes, we know it's happening today, but it doesn't mean that we need to accept the status quo, but challenge it and develop programs that put this into question. Likewise, we need to protect our capacity for anonymity. Independent and well-designed mechanism for redress should also be put in place. And finally, government should ensure that there is an inclusion system at the enrollment stage to ensure that no one is excluding during the implementation phase due to technology or infrastructural gaps. These are some of the biggest challenges based on the current state of the debate on digital ID. And they're because those programs are often presented as voluntary systems that are nonetheless required to access some of the most basic services. This is not a true choice for people, and people's right to access public services should not be restricted on the basis of an enrollment to a voluntary system. Here we need to be careful to not conflate digital ID with legal identity, which is indeed one of the goals of the Sustainable Development Goals. Having a legal identity is different from moving everything into a digital identity, and we need to have an educated and informed discussion with the public of which aspect should be moved where, and we need to give greater part to the public in deciding where to go. Considering that the largely unaddressed human rights raised by digital ideas, this program therefore would need to remain truly voluntary in our perspective. Regarding cybersecurity, we think that more work needs to be done by the industry, civil society, and government alike to better protect the infrastructure using digital ID. We know that there is no such thing as zero risk, but given the amount of information and the sensitivity sometimes of the information that is being linked to those programs, there is a lot of work to be done to ensure that it's delivered in the most secure way as possible. If you take the example of the Aadhaar program in India, which is also one of the largest in the world, the program was recently shown to be compromised due to vulnerabilities in the code and the infrastructure, which created massive risk for people. For a digital ID system to work with as less risk as possible, we would recommend for the systems to be decentralized and adhere to recognized principles such as privacy and security by design, as well as evolving standards for good digital security. We also need to provide a legal and policy framework that incentivizes reporting and disclosure of vulnerabilities. There is a lot of work to be done at European and international level on vulnerability disclosures, not only regarding digital ID, but across the industry. There is a lot of discussion on that at the moment, and this is digital ID is definitely one of the areas where we should be engaging. As mentioned, we can also civil society can also be a resource for the technical development of idea and providing standards for technologies and with technologists in order to ensure that human rights are at the center of those programs. Third, we need to ensure that our data is being protected. In the context of the European Union, when we see digital ID program being developed, of course, government has to respect our data protection framework, which exists for 25 years and have recently been upgraded to the General Data Protection Regulation. But in a lot of places, digital ID programs are being discussed in countries where there is no such things as data protection framework, which create further risk for users. In those contexts, we would recommend that international standards, such as those outlined under the Convention 108 of the Council of Europe, should be applied. It's also important to ensure that the amount of data collected is as limited as possible and only necessary to a specific goal, and that the purpose for which these data are collected and used is clearly defined. There is also a need to engage with data protection authorities, if they exist, as well as legal experts, civil society, throughout the administrative, legislative, and technical design of the ID system from a data protection perspective to ensure that the data that will be shared and accessed is as little as possible. Finally, regarding the access to data by government, we already discussed a little bit today the realm of surveillance and the risk that this creates around that. And there are there are principles that have been developed regarding the access to data by state authority in order to limit those risks, which are the necessary and proportionate principle, which should be applied in the context of digital ID as well. Fourth, like in any type of public debate, it's important to ensure transparency in the development of the program. Without transparency, there will be no accountability, and an element of trust will be already missed in the start of the debate with the public. And we need to ensure that there is transparency as well in the remedy offered to the public. This can be ensured through public consultation, public debates organized prior to the launch of such initiative in order to ensure individuals' representation. There is also a need to ensure continuous stakeholder engagement, including through the participation of users and civil society, as well as test runs. And finally, we cannot continue with the current path of developing digital ID without stopping to build the necessary human rights protection to mitigate harm. To that end, we would suggest a human rights impact assessment to be conducted in countries that use digital ID that don't have all of the safeguards that were previously mentioned, and that any existing or proposed program that do not provide sufficient human rights protection should be immediately suspended or structured. I've heard today from different stakeholders, from government and industry, that do seem to take into account those standards, but again, this is not necessarily what we see in all of the debates around digital ID, and this should be restated as much as possible to ensure that this is the reality that will be delivered. Our civil liberties should be the foundation upon which digital ID technology, platforms and systems are being construed. If not, we risk losing them, and our fundamental right can and will crumble. Let me conclude this presentation by reiterating that the development, deployment and use of those programs should be human-centered, based on transparent and inclusive process with civil society and the public, and right-respecting. The current state of the debate is not yet matching those standards, to the detriment of all. I look forward to your question, but I would also like to extend an invitation to you all. Since I was kindly invited to a forum that is not normally the one of civil society, we also organize a lot of conferences, including one that my organization organized, which is called RightsCon, and will be held in Tunis in next June, where digital ID, technology in general, will be discussed. This conference is at the intersection of human rights and technology, and it would be really great to hear more from vendors, from industry, and from government deploying those strategies, because we're there with the public and with civil society discussing the impact on population, and we need to bridge the gap to bring the two discussions together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Estelle. You answered my first question on making it compulsory. Thank you. Please, Anna.
Thank you very much. You explained us very well about human rights. My question is about social divide. Have you got any study about the impact of digital identity, whether in which condition it increase or decrease the social divide?
I don't have the exact number, but I know my colleagues in India, we have an office in New Delhi, have done some of those research around the Aadhaar program, which was supposed to be a voluntary program, but then became mandatory in order to access to some health services, which led to making it more difficult for some people who could not enter into Aadhaar program to actually access those services. So that's one example that I have from the top of my head. But we also know that some digital ID program made it easier sometimes to access social benefit and make the process just faster for people. But again, here what we need to look at is that we don't have a position saying that those are bad things that should not happen, but it's what are the preconditions and the safeguard that must be in place to ensure that those programs can deliver benefits and social benefits to people, while at the same time not harming human rights. So they're sometimes develop a little bit too quickly to have those discussions, but those are fundamental questions, because when you lose one or the other, it's really hard to getting back.
Yes, may I just add one point? My question is, what about people that are, I would say, digitally unable to use digital identity? So are those people get less right and social helps than the others, than previously? Because previously they could go to the office. Now, if they are not able to use it, so my question is, what about them?
Right. So we follow this as part of our larger connectivity and fight against internet shutdowns also work. There is this objective to connect the next billion and making sure that everybody can have access to reliable, free and open and secure internet. The reality is that there's still a lot of work to be done there, not only in developing in in developing countries, but also in developed countries. There is still a lot of work to be done here, and we do see a divide between urban areas and rural areas in accessibility of those systems in any countries, and there is a risk of creating tiered population with more or less access. So we do see a lot of benefits with online services that help democratize and the access and make it sometimes simpler, but this relies heavily on having the connectivity bandwidth and a level also of education and information on how the system works. So again, as part of all of those debates of bringing everything online, there is all of this question that needs to happen first about the infrastructures, which is a huge part of our work and the reason behind our name as well, because we were created as providing access to some of the part we didn't have.
Thank you very much. This was going to be my question to you, actually, on how you were. Sorry, we have the light in the. On the infrastructure, when the infrastructure is not resilient, or you said you needed still to invest a lot in infrastructure. Is how you're going to deal with this intermediary situation where, if you have no more, physical token to identify. Which was one of the scenarios where you just have a number. Are you, how are you going to deal with that older periods, intermediary period?
Yeah, okay, thank you. Because it is a World Bank project that we are doing and is also developmental in nature, therefore we do all this social safety assessment, which we have not yet concluded, but there is privacy impact assessment and a lot of things. And because the problems are different between that of India and Europe and also Africa, people feel that if they can be saved, the security that is provided, they don't mind having to give their data or being asked mandatory that you must do this before you get this aspect. So, but as you said, a lot of people are living in areas where there is no service. And usually providers of technology do come up with innovative ways, like say, if it is banking services, some people will go to the place because there is at least telephone services, and they can give money to the people and then ask them to transfer to them using just their telephony, informal ways of doing things. So it depends on the actually the usage and the society, but the risks are there, and they are also being checked and being discussed, because we live in a global village. So we do hear in some places, like when they said you can't, in our gazette, that you need the NIN to enroll your child to school. But when India came up with the jurisdiction that you don't need that in education, of course, we need everybody to be educated. But it's a way to make sure that everybody enrolls, not that to disenfranchise them from that education. So there are peculiarities, and then almost most people do think of the common man around them than is being thought of before. Thank you.
If I can add on the infrastructure question, one of the trends we're seeing since 2016 is, even though there is more investment being made on infrastructure, there is also more and more what we qualify as internet shutdowns, which means that for a reason or another, mostly for preserving security around the election or the integrity of school exams, the few governments are mandating telecoms operators to fully shut down the internet or few services during few days or few months or few hours in order to prevent people from communicating. But if you shut down the whole internet, you not only prevent people from posting on Facebook in order to organize protests that you might want to stop, which is already questionable, but you're also completely stopping the full digital economy, and that creates billions and billions of losses in those countries. India is one of the worst perpetrator of internet shutdowns, which are generally local shutdowns to some region. This is not something that luckily we see in Europe, but there is also a trend growing of more network disruptions. So We shouldn't take the infrastructure for granted necessarily, and that's why ensuring that even the infrastructure is decentralized is important, because it's very difficult even for telecoms operators to challenge those requests from government when you need a license to operate from the government. So the infrastructure is also fragile in that sense.
Thank you, Estelle. Any other questions coming from the room? So I would like to thank you, all our great experts who came and spoke today, and thank you for your participation in the room. It's been, I hope you enjoyed this afternoon's track as much as I did. Thank you very much for coming.